Thanks so much for joining this morning for a virtual pop-up conversation with Arkansas Republican French Hill, a member of the House Financial Services Committee. In addition to a few news of the day questions, we're going to focus on issues facing American workers, including rising costs due to inflation and the impact this has on financial security. A big thank you to AFLAC for partnering with us to make this conversation possible. After my interview with Congressman Hill, I'll be talking with Brad Knox, Senior Vice President and Counsel for Federal Relations at AFLAC. As always, a reminder, you can find us on all social media at Punchbowl News, and we encourage you to share this conversation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Congressman Hill to the virtual stage.
Great to be with you, Heather. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me this morning. We always like to start out with a few news of the day questions to get this started. So I want to talk about the topic that's on everyone's mind, the midterms. With the election less than 2 weeks away, Republicans are favored to win the House. Pundits are even predicting they could go back to picking up double-digit seats that had dipped down a little bit in the summer, and now they're back up. Where do you see this going? Do you want to put a prediction out there? How many seats do you see Republicans picking up in the House, and what do you think happens in the Senate?
Well, look, I think that Republicans are gaining momentum as we've gone into the fall during the campaign season because we're talking about the issues that our families are talking about. Here in Arkansas, the median income is about $44,000. And projections here show that that family is spending $7,000 more this year than last year for that same basket of goods, back to school clothes, gas at the pump, groceries for their home kitchen. And so I think the Democrats missed it when they spent all year saying that inflation was going down, it was transitory, it was not President Biden's fault, it was somebody else's fault, or it was big corporations' fault. So I think that's why the momentum is gaining. We have 10 Democratic members in seats won by President Trump. So those 10 seats, and I believe another 10 to 15 seats are possible. So I'm in the camp of 20 to 25 seats pickup for the Republicans. If it was an amazing night, perhaps more. But it does strike me that we'll have a good working majority for the next Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. The Senate, I've been all over the map on, just like the polls have been. I'm not an expert in Senate, but right now I think that momentum again has shifted back to the Republican candidates in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and even potentially New Hampshire.
What do you think if we get to next Congress, there's likely to be a Republican House? Like you said, it's really a toss-up at this point on a Republican Senate. You will have President Biden, a Democrat, in the White House. Do you see areas where you guys can work together to get things done, or do you think it's just going to be much more of a resistance from Congress to the administration kind of next 2 years?
Well, I think there will be a big body of a resistance inside the House, particularly after the last 4 years under Speaker Pelosi's leadership. I think you'll see a robust oversight by the Judiciary Committee, the Oversight Committee, and the Oversight Subcommittees in each of the primary committees of Congress, looking at policy differences that we have with the Biden administration, whether it's dismissing military advice on Afghanistan, looking at the origins of COVID-19, assessing what we could do better on handling COVID in the U.S., the border, the broken border, where administration officials testify routinely that the border is secure, nothing to see here, when everybody in the country knows that that's not true. So I do think oversight will be a big part of the next 2 years. Possibilities for opportunities for mutual legislative activity between the executive and legislative? Sure. I think we'll get an ag bill. I think we'll get an agriculture reauthorization bill. I'd like to see us work together to get flood reform through the House after 17, soon to be 18 can-kicking continuing resolutions on the National Flood Program. President Biden has interest in Cancer, as you know, this is something he was interested in both as vice president and president. I think cancer funding at NIH is something that could be mutually agreed upon. And then we have a large behavioral health set of measures in which I've worked on in regards to the opioid crisis in our country. And I think that's an opportunity as well.
You mentioned oversight, and that's really interesting because we've seen some members of your conference already call to impeach members of the administration, including possibly the president himself. Leader McCarthy, when he talked to us last week, did not seem to want to do that. He wants to investigate, but he doesn't want to pursue impeachment at this point. Where are you in this debate? What do you think?
I think knee-jerk impeachments without laying out a course of why are not good public policy. And I felt that way in the Obama, Trump, and now Biden administration. I have not changed my views on that. So if you believe someone is incompetent, gosh, that's not really an impeachable offense. They need to be subject to incredibly and intense oversight, and perhaps that oversight will let them pursue other activities. They go spend more time with their family and resign. But I think the obligation of a good House and a good Judiciary and Oversight Committee is to identify a challenge. And if you think there's mismanagement or something that's worse, some sort of a truly constitutionally impeachable activity, pursue the case, call witnesses, have both sides representative, and build the case of an investigation that has merit and actually has bipartisan support. That's the way to do it.
I want to pivot to inflation and the economy now. You mentioned, the rising cost, what you're hearing back in your district. I think if you talk to Democrats, including President Biden, he'll say, look, we've done what we can to address this, but a lot of it is out of our control. It's due to supply chain issues. It's due to the energy with the war in Ukraine, things like that. If Republicans take back the House and possibly the Senate, is there a bill that your party can pass to actually help bring down these costs? And if so, what is that?
So this is an important question, and there's not one bill that would, quote, stop inflation. President Biden was warned not to double down and borrow tremendous amounts of money and keep spending in the face of a V-shaped recovery where employment was coming back, and there was tremendous amounts of federal money already in the system, both from the CARES Act spending that was bipartisan in 2020, as well as the stimulus that was put into the economy every day by the Federal Reserve, buying $120 billion of government debt. They bought over $1 trillion plus of government debt during that period. How do we know there's too much money chasing too few goods? Well, we look at the overnight reverse repurchase agreements at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. It hit $2 trillion. That means that there's money floating around the system that no one can productively use. So they park it at the New York Federal Reserve. That ought to tell you all you need to know, that we had too rapid money growth in 2020 and 2021. And this is why Larry Summers, our former Treasury Secretary and National Economic Advisor to President Obama, warned President Biden, don't do the American Rescue Plan. Don't pursue the infrastructure bill. And those things added, and I think President Biden's added nearly $5 trillion of new spending on top of the $4.5 trillion that we spend every year to run the government. So the lead contributor is too much federal stimulus in the light of a booming V-shaped recovery coming out of the pandemic. Secondly, the Fed kept their foot on the accelerator much too long, and they should have eased up in Q4 of 2020. Many of us were arguing that case. They should not have green-lighted any more spending by the Biden administration. And then finally, you're right. There were supply chain disruptions, not only due to the war in Ukraine, but production in Asia. But who made that worse? The Biden administration, by mandating employment only connected to the vaccine, or curtailing American energy production through actions taken by this administration or implied by this administration. So there's no one bill. So Republicans, if we have the ability to get back managing the House, will be arguing to unleash American energy production, bring down prices at home by increasing production back to pre-pandemic levels. We'll propose not adding taxes on the productive part of society or making it hard to hire employees. And we'll certainly encourage the Fed as the independent central bank to do its job to beat this inflation, because inflation is a thief and it's hurting our seniors and it's hurting our hardworking families.
And I want to pivot to the Fed, and let's talk about the Fed a little bit. I mean, as you mentioned, we're seeing historic costs when it comes to food, fuel, healthcare. I mean, really impacting people across the country. This week, Senator Sherrod Brown, Banking Committee Chair, sent a letter to the Fed. They're meeting next week to probably raise rates again, and warn them he has concern about the impact on the labor market. Is there a risk of the Fed going too fast to raise rates? And I'm wondering where you are in this, because I know that you have talked about how the Fed should not focus on, full employment. It should really focus on price stability as its mandate. So do you worry about the Fed moving too fast? I mean, this is the fastest pace we've seen in 40 years.
Well, I think as I said, the Federal Reserve is behind. They're a contributor to why we have 8% inflation, the highest in 40 years, as you note. The central bank just made a mistake, and they've acknowledged that it was a mistake. And Secretary Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, has acknowledged that it was a mistake and that inflation is not transitory. So they're taking the steps they believe necessary. But here's the challenge. They're at odds with fiscal and regulatory policy. So actually, Joe Biden's fiscal policies and his regulatory policies are making the Fed's job harder to roll back this pernicious inflation. As to Sherrod Brown's comments, here's my philosophy about this. The central bank has one mission, price stability. They're supposed to prevent inflation. They're supposed to maintain the value of the dollar for that Arkansas family that has seen a huge loss in purchasing power. So they've failed. And that's why I argue that the Fed should only have one mandate, and that's price stability. The aspect of full employment involves the entire government, like fiscal policy and the executive branch regulatory policy. So the burden, in my view, on full employment is policies put forth by the legislative and executive branches. And that has that primary responsibility as to the conditions precedent and the proper macro policies to produce full employment. It relates to so many factors. None of them are really controlled by the Fed. And that's why I think the Fed should be solely focused on price stability and let the legislative and executive branches follow up and perform their task as to policies that relate to maintaining or enhancing full employment.
And that's a very interesting point, because I think a lot of Democrats are on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, in the House, they passed a bill earlier this year that would actually expand the Fed's mandate to address racial inequality and disparities, for example. And that bill is not going to get picked up in the Senate, but there's such a spectrum of debate here about, what the Fed should be doing and how. Right. And
go ahead. Heather, just on that point, I mean, we talk about having an independent central bank. We don't want it politicized. And yet here, people are trying to expand the Fed's mission and mandate. It's not the role of the Fed. The Fed doesn't need to have additional mandates. They're not going to solve socioeconomic challenges, in my view, by an active and a proper monetary policy. They can help people of all income brackets by not allowing inflation to get out of control. So I led the debate on the House floor against Maxine Waters' efforts to expand the Fed to take into account socioeconomic issues. I believe that's the proper role for the legislative and the executive branches.
I want to shift again, because time is quickly dwindling down. I have a lot I want to get to you. Policymakers have been talking about the possibility of a central bank digital currency. It's also sometimes called a digital dollar, as I know you're very familiar with as a former banker and also on the House Financial Services Committee. There's a lot of debate over whether this is needed, but I think people generally agree that if it is and if it does exist, Congress would need to be involved. Where are you on the digital dollar? As a former banker, what privacy concerns do you have or other concerns with the creation of something like that?
Right. Well, the central bank digital currency issue is gained momentum. Bill Foster of Illinois and I first raised this issue and asked the Fed to study it during the 2018 and 2019 period, so pre-pandemic. And both Chairman Powell and Secretary Mnuchin really felt like that it wasn't an issue, and it wouldn't be an issue for 5 years, I think Secretary Mnuchin said in his testimony before the committee. But nonetheless, we urge them to study it and tell us what are the problems with it for consumer privacy? How would it impact monetary policy? Is this something that the Fed, in their view, or the Treasury thinks is even necessary for the United States as it relates to our role as the reserve currency, or that it would benefit our banking system? We don't have that study, but our work caused the Fed to commission a study at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, working with MIT. And then President Biden has asked for those same kinds of studies to be produced by Treasury and other agencies. Here's the bottom line. The Constitution gives currency and money to the responsibility of the legislative branch, and we delegate that to Treasury, who has an agent called the Federal Reserve. So we don't believe that a new form of money, a digital dollar, can be introduced into the economy without a specific authorization from Congress. And Ranking Member Patrick McHenry and I in the last couple of weeks wrote Merrick Garland asking for clarification that in fact it does take a specific legislative action by Congress on that. There seems to be some confusion in the Beltway on that, even though both Jay Powell and Lael Brainerd have testified basically to that fact. So we want to get that clarity. And then I know in the incoming Congress, we'll have robust hearings on this and discussion about it. And as you know, Patrick McHenry and Maxine Waters have talked about the idea of a federally regulated and state regulated stable coin. And is this digital form of the dollar preempt the need for a central bank digital currency? So that's where the debate is now. Very interesting, important to the future of financial innovation in the payment system. And House Republicans will be there in a leadership way.
And you bring up a great point. I want to ask you about these stablecoin negotiations. Do you expect any action on this issue in the lame duck, or do you think, it all kind of gets kicked to next year with potentially and likely Republicans in power? And like you said, McHenry is probably chairman.
Yeah. Well, John Boehner has a famous quote about Congress. Congress moves very slowly until it doesn't.
Right.
And so we'll wait and see. I think Chair Waters and Ranking Member McHenry have made a lot of progress on the draft. The drafts received good public comment from the private and public sectors. So that doesn't take it out of the realm of possibility that something could be done here in the lame duck. But if not, we'll have the pen in the new Congress and be able to design a policy. I'll just simply say Patrick McHenry and Chair Waters have worked hard on this. They've had good cooperation from the Biden Treasury. So we'll see what happens.
And we're almost out of time, but I really quickly want to ask you about flood insurance. You mentioned it earlier, the program, it has to be reauthorized in December. Like you said, it's in dire need of structural reforms that Congress has just not addressed for a long time. What do you expect to really happen with this program this year and maybe early next year, if anything?
Well, I would hope that we could have a good conversation with coastal members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and find a way to move the program to a permanent 5-year, not permanent, but a 5-year reauthorization where we can have some programmatic improvements that lower the risk of the program while helping resilience funding and helping low moderate income buyers of the program have assistance as well. These were the parameters of a deal going back to 2015 and 2016 that we just didn't get over the goal line. And I hope we can make strong progress on that in the new Congress.
Here's to hoping, sir. It looks like we're out of time, but I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. We had a very robust conversation on inflation, the economy, and a potential Republican majority in the House. Thank you, Congressman Hill.
You bet, Heather. Great to be with you.
And now I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage Brad Knox, Senior Vice President and Counsel, Federal Relations at AFLAC. Brad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Heather, thank you. What a great opportunity it is to talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited. Just quickly, for those in the audience who don't know you and your role at AFLAC, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I have the great privilege of representing AFLAC in Washington, D.C. Basically, I tell people from the Capitol to the White House, the legal and regulatory issues that the company faces, and helping support our reputation and our brand in D.C. with our constituents here.
We just heard from Congressman Hill on the economy and rising costs across the board for Americans and the impact in districts like his, including healthcare costs. And I wanted to dig a little deeper with you on that. What trends are you seeing when it comes to healthcare, medical debt cost, and the economy right now?
Well, I tell you, Congressman Hill hit on some very important points, and what we're seeing. His constituency is our constituency. Those are the folks who buy our products. And what they want and need desperately is financial security. And they see that in supplemental products. What we know through a history, we've been doing a survey every year for the last over a decade. I think we're in our 12th year now, of something we call the AFLAC Workforces Report. And we survey employees and employers about how they feel about benefits, and we know those are very important. And what we know is 58% of employees can't put their hands on $1,000 of savings if they run into a medical or health situation. We know that with, as Congressman Hill mentioned, the cost of everything, and then you add on to that the increased cost of healthcare, and that includes, I'll tell you, Heather, it's open enrollment season. So even for a company like ours, which cares deeply about its employees and does over and above what most employers do for their employees, I can tell you that our premiums, our co-pays, our deductibles, the benefits, the out-of-pocket expenses, all increasing. And that's with a company that's doing more than most. So when you take that into consideration and look at all the things that people have to spend money on, and it's more than normal, the cost of healthcare is a significant driver of medical debt. So, in fact, we know that over 90% of Americans today have some form of health insurance, and a third of those still have medical debt. So the concept is people need to understand health insurance isn't designed to cover all the expenses someone has to face when they have a major health event. And that's where supplemental comes in.
Yeah, and the statistic you mentioned from the Workforces Report, it really stood out to me too, because it was like almost half of employees said essentially they're like one serious health issue away from needing to lean on debt or credit to kind of cover these costs, which is, I mean, that's a huge statistic to me. And I was wondering, is this in a post-COVID world? Is it due to the current state of the economy? Or is this a trend that you guys, since you mentioned you've been doing this report for about a dozen years now, is this a trend that you've been seeing since pre-COVID?
Well, we've seen this trend pre-COVID, but it's been exacerbated since COVID because that number is a 12% increase from the prior year. So, you take just the lifestyle adjustments that people have had to make through COVID, and you add on top of that these increases in everything from milk, a gallon of milk, to gas, to the things that they really they have to have with their health insurance. And again, these are people who are working hard Americans, and they're doing the things that they're supposed to, like getting their health insurance from their employer, and they still are struggling to have their financial needs met when they have a diagnosis of cancer, or they have an accident, end up in the hospital, and they have a prolonged hospital stay, or whatever it is. There's so many expenses that they face that aren't contemplated or designed to be paid for through major medical or traditional health insurance. And I'll tell you, it's what's interesting is policymakers, they know, and of course, we're probably the most recognizable brand when it comes to health insurance and supplemental. We created the space. But they don't really understand that gap of financial, that financial gap that people face. And what we really hope is that they can begin to understand this is really more, I would call it family care insurance, right? How families can care for for themselves through these crises by not having to worry about these financial gaps.
And I actually wanted to ask you about that. I do think, especially on the Hill covering Congress, there is some confusion among policymakers about what supplemental insurance does, how it relates to major medical insurance. And I wanted to ask you, do you agree with that assessment? And also, do you think that the pandemic or where we are in the economy has had an impact on the policy views towards supplemental insurance here in Washington?
So I think the pandemic helped policymakers think differently about how to take care of people. For example, the use of telehealth. People understand that it was required during the pandemic, and it's an important way for people to access medical support. On the issue of supplemental, I still don't think policymakers really get it. In the sense that they still think traditional health insurance covers everyone's needs. And as I mentioned, when you think about the increase in copays or the increase in deductibles and the out-of-pocket expenses, those are purposely designed out of traditional health insurance, and those costs are going up. So how do you support families that are struggling to make ends meet when if you're not really understanding that they need more supplemental coverage, they need more opportunities for financial stability, and that's a big issue.
Congressman Hill, and he's definitely not alone in this assessment, said he expects Republicans to win the House, maybe pick up double-digit seats, have a really big working majority, and possibly win the Senate. What do you expect to happen with healthcare policy if Republicans take control of the House and or the Senate? Like, what are you watching for in the next couple of years?
Well, I would agree with the assessment for the House, and as the Congressman said, I would don't take me to Vegas to figure out the Senate, right? I just couldn't tell you. But what I do know is, the opportunity to speak with members like Congressman Hill, and really, on both sides, to be able to recognize the families that are impacted by health policy. And let's solve those problems. And let's find ways to support those problems. The issue, Heather, frankly, is there are some bad actors in the market. And there's attempts by the administration to, solve for that, which we get. We understand that. But we're not, short-term limited duration policy. We're not traditional healthcare. We're not trying to substitute. And as an industry, we don't sell or market our policies as a substitute for healthcare. We think everyone should have health coverage. And along with that, make sure that the financial gaps that you might face, you can have a peace of mind by having supplemental coverage instead, on top of that.
I mean, you bring up a great point. How realistic is it, though, do you think, that Democrats and Republicans come together and address this issue in a meaningful way?
Well, that's our job, right? So I'm always optimistic. I'm always optimistic because every district has families that are working to take care of their future. And that's what we do. And so if we're doing our job, then we'll be able to have a bipartisan solution for it.
And my job is to report on whether everyone is doing their job. Just so it's an ecosystem. Finally, Brad, we're almost out of time, but I like to wrap these conversations with kind of a broad scene setting question. Like, in the next 3 to 5 years, big picture, what would you like to see from Congress? What do you expect from Congress when it comes to supplemental insurance and broadly healthcare policy in Washington?
Well, what I'd like to see is really a greater understanding that that these policies are important for people's financial security and stability. It's really, if there are bad actors, deal with bad actors, but to really embrace the industry in such a way that they recognize it helps solve issues that are really important for families, so that they can go on living their lives, right? and not worry about bills that they weren't expecting, bills that they didn't realize that they were going to be seeing when they have a major issue. And for policymakers to really embrace that and realize we're part of the ecosystem. We're part of having families take care of themselves. And I think if we can get to that point, we'll all be in a better place.
Well, Brad, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining me today. A big thank you to Congressman Hill and his staff, and to AFLAC for partnering with us to make this conversation happen. And a big thank you to everyone who joined me on the live stream. We have several more events coming up over the next few months, including a conversation with Senator Mark Warner about the impact of 5G on energy in November. You can check out our event hub at punchbowl.news and find out about all of our upcoming events. And thank you so much for joining. Stay safe and have a great day.